Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, ma'am. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Audible,
Ma'am,
visible.
yes, ma'am, you're audible, you're visible, but we have a few minutes of break now. The next session starts at 11:40.
11:40. It's just 2 minutes away from.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Hi. How are you, Anshu?
I'm good, ma'am. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm just looking at the paper presenters. This session: Sumbul, Sayantan, Neha, Kavita, and Azima. Okay.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, Sayantan. How are you? Best
I'm
of luck.
fine, ma'am. Thank you. How are you, ma'am?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Doing well.
Good morning, Sheetal ma'am.
Good morning, Neha. How have you been?
Ma'am, I'm good, ma'am. How have you been?
Fine, fine. अभी तो थोड़ा सा ओपन अप हो रहा है तो लेट्स थिंक अबाउट सम एक्टिविटीज आल्सो ऑफलाइन बट अंटिल दैट ऑफलाइन ऑनलाइन भी चलेगा पार्टिसिपेंट्स आर हाँ
Yeah,
चाहिए
like, can we just do a mic test?
Good morning.
हाँ प्लीज डू सो
Also, I would just request all the participants to switch on their cameras so that I can just put spotlight on them, and then you can switch it off.
हाँ हाय कुंबुल
Am I audible, Anshu?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Spotlight. So there is Sumbul is on spotlight. Neha is on spotlight. Neha is on spotlight. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Neha on spotlight. Kavita. Miss Kavita Singh. Miss Kavita Singh. Miss Azima. Miss Azima. Azima, can you please? Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just put the spotlight on you. Just a second.
Hello, Sheetal ma'am. So
Hi.
nice to see you after so long.
Hi Zima
Miss Kavita, is she here? I can't see her in the waiting room or. Okay, so let's just do a quick mic test. Miss Sumbul Paveen.
Hi Anshu, am I audible?
Yeah, Sumbul, great. Mr. Sayantan Ghoshal. Mr. Sayantan.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Hi.
you're audible.
How are you?
I'm good. Miss Neha Kishore.
Hi, Anshu.
Hi, Neha. Miss Kavita Singh. So she's missing, I think. She's missing. Miss Azima.
Hi.
Hi, great. Okay, so we just have Kavita missing. Okay.
Sumbul
Should I switch the video and unmute myself now?
Yeah. You can do anything now.
Okay.
not anything you have to wait for your paper presentation don't go and start playing football
It's very hot in Calcutta right now.
Acha. And how is the election scenario?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It's
High pitch
electrifying
drum.
atmosphere.
Haan. Kavita Singh. So,
Anshu, you also have to, I think, put spotlight on chair because chair is not.
Yes, sir. Oh, yes.
good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine.
No, I
Good
said
morning,
chair-
sir.
No, they're putting spotlight on everyone, but not on the chair.
There's already spotlight on ma'am. She's already under spotlight.
No, but I don't see her on the main panel.
Just a second.
Good morning, sir.
Hi, good morning. Kaise ho bhai?
Sir,
But I
I'm good, sir.
see myself in the corner window.
She's not in the spotlight. You have to put on spotlight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that ad spotlight is not being enabled. Just a second.
No, whosoever is the administrator would have to do it. If you are.
Just a second. I'll just.
But I'm happy not to be visible on central panel.
You have to be on the center panel.
Anshu, you are in the under spotlight and in the central panel.
Okay, I don't know how that's just a second.
Hi,
Yeah, in
Bashruti.
fact, you
Hi,
should just remove
but
everybody else.
Sheetal is on the top of the world.
But you should just keep only chair and presenters. Just remove everybody else. I think that will be better.
Yeah, we're doing that only. I don't know why it's not happening.
Yeah, now you're up. Then Sheetal has to come down.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe there.
Do I need to make some settings from my end also?
No, nothing.
Oh, that's
I think ma'am is on spotlight now. It's been added to her.
Acha, and it is a
You want to
gallery.
remove me.
The host has spotlighted your video for everyone. Okay.
Yeah,
all-
yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, so yeah, like we still don't have Miss Kavita Singh.
Give her 2-3 minutes because we'll start at 11:45 if you say.
Okay, we have her here. Miss Kavita Singh.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Can you please switch on your camera so that we can put spotlight on you, and then you can switch it off.
Okay, 1 second, please. Am I visible?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, Kavita. Thank you so much. Okay, so
Okay.
shall we begin?
Anshu, start.
Okay. So good morning, respected teachers and my dear friends. So we are now moving to the 6th session of the Young Researchers Conference titled Immigration, Integration and Civil Society. This session will be chaired by Professor Sheetal Sharma. She's a professor at the Center for European Studies and is popularly known as the social scientist of the center. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Good morning to everyone, and I welcome you to the second session of second day of 2-day Your Mone Chair conference organized by Professor Bhashwati Sarkar. And I thank Chairperson Professor Gulshan Sachdev and Bhashwati to give me this opportunity to chair the session and listen to the ideas and perspectives, views of young scholars in our center and across the centers, and in fact from all over India. The conference has really been very successful, and I was coming in and out of the sessions to observe, what kind of perspectives are being shared. And in this particular session, we are almost on time because there was a coffee break in between. The title of the session, as you have seen in the program, is Immigration, Integration, and the Civil Society. And there are 5. Kavita, you have to mute yourself. And in this session titled as Immigration, Integration and the Civil Society, we have 5 presenters who are going to talk about the aspects related to social integration, role of civil society, and the idea related to social integration, cohesion, asylum policy vis-a-vis immigration. So not taking much time, I invite the first speaker, Sumbul Praveen, research scholar from Center for European Studies, JNU, to present her paper, which is titled as Immigration and Politics in Denmark. She's covering 2 decades, 1993 to 2000, no, 1 decade only, 1993 to 2003. Sumbul, over to you.
Okay.
Just a second, Sumbul, I think, before you start, I have one request to all presenters, those who are going to make presentation. If they can just, put their videos on, because they are on Spotlight and the recording, at least now for the presentation part, they should be on video. Otherwise, the video for the presenters would not be half, it won't look nice because the recording is being done. I can see.
Yeah, that's
If you could also put on your video, unless you have some serious objection of not putting your video on.
Sumbul?
Yes, should I start?
Yes. If you have a presentation, then it's fine. Share it with us.
No,
Otherwise, start. Yeah.
No, I'll give it that way only. So thank you, Chair. A very good morning to all of you. The title of my presentation is Immigration and Politics in Denmark, 1993 to 2003. My presentation takes the case study of the Nordic country Denmark and the politicization of immigration integration from 93 to 2003. However, as part of broader analysis, it would also very briefly discuss the current developments. So first of all, I begin by laying out party positions of 5 main Danish parliamentary parties on the immigration issue. So on the right-left continuum, the Liberal and the Conservative parties can be placed at the right position, the Progress Party and the Danish People's Party, far right, the Social Democrats who used to be on the left but have now drifted to the center-right position, and the Social Liberals who have always been on the left. So in 1993, an official judicial inquiry found the Conservative Minister of Justice, Erik Ninn-Hansen, guilty of having ordered his ministry to slow down the processing of the family reunification applications by the family members of Sri Lankan Tamil refugees already living in Denmark, with a view to pressurizing them to leave for their home country. It was also concluded that the Conservative Prime Minister Poul Schlüter knew of his minister's illegal activities and even misled the parliament on the issue. This, dubbed as the Tamilgate scandal, had significant political consequences. Firstly, Poul Schlüter resigned as the Prime Minister and was replaced by a center-left coalition headed by the Social Democrat Poul Nyrup Rasmussen. Secondly, Erik Ninn-Hansen was sentenced to 4 months imprisonment and was later impeached by the Danish parliament, which was the first in 83 years. Now, after the fall of the government, the Liberal and the Conservative parties shifted to the right and began to adopt staunch anti-immigration stance. Even the political rhetoric began to bear similarities with the xenophobic Progress Party. The reason for the closeness to the Progress Party was realization on their part that the only way they could come back to government was to win a majority, and supported by the Progress Party and later on by the Danish People's Party, which splintered from the Progress Party in 1995. Now, the creation of these new party constellations in 1993 resulted in immigration becoming intrinsic to the Danish politics. Now, I'll very quickly come to the 1994 general elections, during which immigration was vigorously politicized and the political discourse sharpened. So 4 discursive strategies were used. First was the positive representation of the us. So for instance, the Liberal Party saying that we are a humanitarian party, Denmark is a democratic country, we respect freedom, human rights, etc. The second was the negative representation of the other. So for instance, I would quote the official discourses, quote unquote, quite a few refugees returned to the countries they fled from for holidays. Second, many asylum applicants obviously apply for no reason. Third was the criminalization of the immigrants. So for instance, derogatory and vilifying labels were used against them, for instance, criminal asylum seekers. Then there is growing criminalization among immigrants. Immigrants commit more crimes than the Danes, etc. And the last strategy was securitization of immigration. So for instance, a lot of Danish politicians began to associate immigrants with unspecified problems in Denmark. And then there was also, this quotation by the Liberal Party, which said that we don't want a so-called multi-ethnic society. Then deport refugees if they commit crimes, abolish the right to vote or be elected in municipality elections for non-Nordic people, stricter naturalization, make immigrants non-eligible for public support. So these were the official discourses which were repeatedly used by the various political parties, especially the Liberal and the Conservative parties and the Progress Party. The Social Democratic government survived the 94 elections, but then it made them realize that immigration has now become so integral to the Danish politics. Now, I'll very quickly come to the 2001 general elections, which were held in the aftermath of the 9/11, when religion had begun to play the central role and anti-Islam sentiments expressed openly. So what's important here is that while the Liberal and the Conservative Party focused on the immigration issue, criticizing the government for not having introduced toughened asylum measures, the Progress Party and later the Danish People's Party, which splintered from the Progress Party, explicitly fought on an anti-Islam platform. This anti-Islam rhetoric had the desired result. So in a poll conducted just a few days before the election date, 2 on 3 Danes now supported stringent immigration policy as compared to 1 on 2 prior to 9/11. The 2001 election resulted in the victory of the Liberal Conservative party and supported by the DPP. Now, what's important to illuminate is that since 2001, there has not just been only vehement politicization of immigration and political discourses becoming sharper, but also there has been a shift from anti-immigrant stance to anti-Muslim immigrant stance. So opposition to veil, mosque, headscarf, halal food, all these Muslim symmetry became frequent. Muslims increasingly came to be painted as threat to Danish values, and the Muslim values being incompatible with the Danish values. Now, I'll very quickly come to the integration policy, which was introduced in I'll just add a point here that from 2001 there was also it was also observed that the Social Democrats, who used to be on the left, drifted to the center-right position primarily because of two reasons. So the first was that there emerged a hardliner wing within the party to which the top leadership succumbed, and the second was realization on their part that a lax immigration approach might result in loss of the electorate. So these were the two prime reasons for them to change their approach towards immigration. Now I'll come to the integration policy, which was introduced in 1998. And at that point in time, it identified integration specifically as the effective labor market participation and economic self-sufficiency of the immigrants. However, from 2001, since the coming of the center-right coalition government, there came a mutation in their nature, wherein they began to focus more on the cultural aspect, and the Danish government now, acting as the defender of the Danish homogeneous values. So, what's important to highlight is that while the majority was expected to, and I underline it, understand the minority culture, the minorities have to adapt to the majority culture. So the difference between understanding and adapting. So the onus was basically on the minority to assimilate into the Danish values. Now I'll come to the current developments, and particularly focusing the post 2015 refugee crisis. So during the 2015 refugee crisis, Denmark received a total of 21,225 asylum applications, and the Social Democratic government then introduced some alterations, some stern measures regarding immigration. But then when in June 2015 the Liberal Conservative Party came to power, supported by the DPP, they put in really some austere measures. So for instance, the first was the jewelry law, which authorizes police to confiscate valuables from refugees exceeding 1,340 euros and without sentimental values to pay for their living cost. The second was the time period to apply for family reunification was increased from 1 year to 3 years of residence. And then work requirement was now important to avail the introduction or the integration benefit. Then, in 2018, the government imposed a ban on full face veil, commonly referred to as the burqa ban. Then in 2018, Denmark also introduced one of its most contentious initiatives, which is called as the No Ghetto in 2030 initiative, under which, and as of now, 2020, 28 areas in Denmark have been designated as ghettos, and based on certain criteria like employment, education, crime rate, population, etc. And there is a possibility that the government might demolish them to bring about a change in their character. And then under this initiative, it was also then introduced in 2019 that the children of Muslim immigrants from these ghettos from the age 1 would have to now join Danish classes 25 hours per week, which would impart them teaching in Danish values, telling them about Christian holidays like Christmas, Easter. And then what's more, and a punitive measure was also brought in, that if they fail to comply with that, they would lose their welfare benefit. Then in 2019 there was again the general elections, and the Social Democrats came back to power, which already had now drifted to the center-right position. But then this time they did tone down their anti-immigration stance, but that was particularly because in lieu of forming the government, because it was the demand put forward by the left-leaning parties who said that we would support you to form the government, only when you tone down your anti-immigration approach. So they did introduce some important measures. For instance, Denmark agreed to resume the intake of refugees under the UN quota, which it had suspended since 2016, and there were some other measures also. But then what's also important is that practically it has continued with the right approach of the outgoing government. In fact, it was under the Social Democratic government that in 2020, under the No Ghetto in 2030 initiative, it was put forward that by 2030, 40% of the population of these ghettos would be slashed. So this would lead to displacement of at least 11,000 people. And then last year, the government also decided to classify the Muslim immigrants separately in their official employment and crime statistics. So, as of now, it was only classification between Western immigrants and non-Western immigrants. Now, non-Western immigrant category is further split into two, which is first is the 24 MENAPT. So MENAPT stands for Middle Eastern, North African, Pakistan, and Turkey. So all immigrants hailing from these regions would be classified separately, and the remaining 166 nationalities would be classified under just a common category, which is non-Western. So the singling out of the Muslim immigrants even in their official statistical representations. Now, as part of broader analysis, juxtaposing Denmark's current attitude towards immigration integration with its past policies, I think it would not be wrong to say that Denmark is deriving its present attitude from its past policies, and it's very much ingrained in its past handling of the immigration and integration issues. And then secondly, what's important to note is that since, while initially in the formative years, there was this it was like different political parties held different positions on immigration integration. But since 2016, there has emerged a parliamentary consensus on strict immigration rules. So for instance, even in 2015, when the asylum rules were put in, it was based on a cross-party consensus between 6 parties. So, I'll just now wrap up that looking at the trajectory of Denmark's approach towards immigration integration, one thing which is very noticeable is that Denmark has increasingly, become restrictive, not just towards immigrants, but also in particular Muslim immigrants, keeping its door of immigration ajar. And then, there has been now a more concerted, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim stance. So I think here I would like to end my presentation and would open it to questions. Thank you.
Very good, Sumbul. Very good analysis of last 10 years particularly, and later on integrating the entire period after 2003. Do we take question answers right now or at the end, Bhashwati?
At the end.
At the end. Okay, yes. So I think we have 1 hour left. So I'll invite the second speaker quickly, Sayantan Ghosal, who is also a research scholar at Center for European Studies. Sayantan, over to you. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. My topic is Denmark's and Sweden's implementation of the European refugee and asylum policy during the 2050 refugee crisis. So I'll briefly start with the fact that Europe has been receiving a lot of refugees since the 20th century because of the 2 world wars and also at the end of the Cold War period. So a need was felt to harmonize the policies providing asylum to check the secondary movement of the people into a destination of their choice. So some of the notable measures in this regard were the 1990 Dublin Convention, which was a convention to determine the member state responsible for assessing the asylum applications. And after that, there was also the 1999 Amsterdam Treaty, which laid down that within a period of 5 years, certain rules, mechanisms need to be adopted so as to identify which member state is responsible for assessing the asylum claim. However, it was the 1999 Tampere Conclusions, which laid the foundation of a common European asylum system. It was launched in 2 phases. The first phase set out common minimum standards that need to be adopted by the member states in the case of receiving the asylum seekers. And also it pointed out that in the case of reception of asylum seekers, certain minimum standards need to be followed. The second phase was launched by the Hague program. It was launched in December 2004. It transcended beyond the common minimum standards and focused on the common procedures that need to be followed by all the member states. It also stressed on a fair share of responsibility and also focused on the principle of solidarity. Now, briefly, I will come as to how these two states, Denmark and Sweden, lie on this spectrum. So as Sumbul already said, Denmark had an anti-immigrant stance since the 1990s. This is because a lot of immigrants in the 70s, 80s had come to the country, though they were small in numbers, but soon their descendants started growing large in numbers. So the Danish state felt as a threat to its national identity. Denmark was always known for its homogeneous population. Most of the immigrants after the Second World War till the 1990s were from the other Nordic countries and mostly white people. So this growing of population in the 70s, 80s from places like Iran, Iraq, Chile, Vietnam, etc., was considered as a threat to its national identity. So it became debates on immigration and integration became heavily politicized in the mid 90s. Post 2001, the country also put several strict reforms like the 21-year family reunification rule, and also there were reforms on permanent residency where it was required 7 years of legal residency was required, and also intertwining with the Danish culture and the society, where they had to clear integration exams and society exams. Also in 2007, this rule was further hardened, where in case of when you had to bring your spouse also needed to clear this exam, the integration exam. And also in 2007, you needed 2 years you needed to show that you have worked in Denmark for 2.5 years if you wanted permanent residency. This attitude has also been seen during the refugee crisis of 2015. The Danish did not accept, they were in 2000 during the refugee crisis, they had adopted a law called the emergency brake law so as to override the Dublin III regulation and not to seek asylum seekers that came to its borders during that period. As Sumbul mentioned, the jewelry law was also another bizarre law which allowed them to confiscate around more than anyone wearing jewelry which is above 10,000 Danish kronas. Now, recently, Denmark has also adopted a strict stance towards immigration. This can be seen by a new integration law which has been passed in the parliament called the Paradigm Shift. This focuses more on repatriation than integration. This is of the view that if if the situation in the refugee home country improves, then the state will send these refugees back to their home country. At the end of January 2021, the Integration and Immigration Minister Tafai has also commented that we are pushing forward for a zero asylum policy agenda. We cannot guarantee that we will be able to make it work, but we are definitely putting forward towards a vision like this. In contrast, it can be seen that Sweden had held a much liberal attitude towards the refugees. This can be seen the way it received refugees in the 70s, 80s, and also in the 90s, after the breakdown of Soviet Union and the breakdown of Yugoslavia. In 2000s also, it also implemented certain liberal reforms for refugees. For example, in 2006, the state broadened its definition of refugees, to incorporate people who were perceived with the threat of persecution because of their gender and sexual preferences. Also, in the case of unaccompanied children, the state provided them guardian during the process of seeking asylum. In 2006, the asylum seekers were also, allowed to contest the decisions given by the Swedish Migration Board regarding their asylum proposals in the migration courts. In 2018, also, the Swedish Immigration Act also provided a very job-friendly stance towards the immigrants. The asylum seekers whose applications have been rejected, they were also given an opportunity, to stay and apply for work for a limited period, for a limited time frame. And if they could find employment during this time, they were given work permits. This friendly attitude of Sweden has also been seen during the 2015 refugee crisis, because other member states like Poland, Hungary, Greece, Denmark, etc., did not apply the principle of solidarity and shied away from the responsibility of accepting asylum seekers. Sweden took in a record number of asylum seekers. It went on taking in asylum seekers until the point it felt that its welfare system would be unable to cope with it. and then it had put in strict controls. Also, Prime Minister Le Pen in November 2015 said at last that we need respite and we cannot do any more. So at this was the point of time that Sweden said no, and until that point of time, it was always receiving refugees. And so in 2016, it started putting in more controls to control, putting in more strict controls to regulate this incoming of refugees to its borders. So it started giving temporary residence permits. For example, refugees were given 3-year, residency permits. And but however, Sweden now wants to revert this temporary law, which was started in 2016. Sweden now wants to do away with it. In 2020, the state has formed a committee so that the committee brings out a migration policy which is more effective, human friendly, and which is in sync with the policies it had before 2016, before the refugee crisis took place. So to conclude, I would say that Denmark and Sweden have always displayed very contrasting attitudes, given that they are both EU member states and they are under the CES protocol. But however, Denmark has opted out for Dublin III regulation in 2013. Also, it had opted out from Dublin II regulation in 2003. Also, during the refugee crisis, they displayed very divergent stances. So, if we line CES as a spectrum, we can say both Denmark and Sweden line on the divergent ends of spectrum. I finished my presentation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sayantan, for bringing this understanding of positions difference between Denmark and Sweden. And as both these speakers have pointed out, about the refugee crisis, immigration, anti-immigrant stand, and somehow gravitating towards anti-Islam stand. We'll have more presentations related to this. And I congratulate both of you in the middle of the session only to bring out such a clear-cut thought about how you perceive the system. And now I invite Neha Kishore, research scholar from Center for European Studies, JNU, to speak on immigration, cultural diversity, and legal system in the United Kingdom. Neha, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bhaswati ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. My paper first explains the challenges that immigration and the consequent legal pluralism poses for the British state in terms of women's rights in marriage and divorce. And secondly, my paper suggests the legal changes that are needed and that can address this issue. Immigration has resulted in an increased religious and cultural diversity across Europe, creating complex social identities. Because of the various religious family laws and customary laws, the consequent legal pluralism poses a challenge to the state judicial and legal system. The settlement of a large number of Muslim immigrants in the UK poses multiple challenges to the British state. One of the biggest challenges is the plural legal system because of the presence of a huge minority population in the UK. Given the monolithic legal tradition in the UK, where the state applies the same laws to all, the impact of these laws varies across communities, and the state has struggled to find a response to the particular socio-legal needs of the Muslim community. The Muslim community and the Islamic scholars established Sharia councils in the UK in the 1980s. According to a government report of 2018, the number of Sharia councils in the UK is increasing, and the number of people who approach these Sharia councils is also increasing. The majority of the users of Sharia councils are women who approach these councils to obtain a religious divorce, mostly khula. However, the British legal system does not recognize Sharia officially. This means that the decisions taken by Sharia councils are not given official recognition. The marriages and divorces taking place in accordance with the Muslim family laws are not recognized as valid in the UK. Now, women in a religious-only marriage have the legal status of a cohabitee. So when there is a breakdown of the relationship, women cannot seek a civil divorce and hence are not entitled to the financial benefits that accompany a divorce. This leaves them vulnerable should the relationship end. The problem is that an increasing percentage of Muslim couples are married only through a religious ceremony, that is a nikah. The government report of 2018 puts it at 60%, and it states that such percentage is increasing. This is a problematic trend for Muslim women's rights. There are several reasons why Muslim couples fail to register their marriage civilly and only have a religious marriage. The first is that there is lack of awareness that Islamic marriages need to be registered civilly to be legal. The second is that there is confusion because Islamic marriages that are conducted overseas are considered to be legally valid, but the same religious ceremony in the UK is not considered to be legally valid. Muslim men may avoid a civil marriage because it gives their wives more rights. Also, not registering their marriages enables Muslim men to practice polygamy without violating the British bigamy laws. There could also be individuals who choose to opt out of the mainstream societal processes due to identity issues. Why women seek an Islamic divorce? Because the women who have a religious only marriage are not entitled to get a civil divorce. Secondly, women's own religious beliefs and compulsions from their family or their community may require a religious divorce before accepting the end of the relationship and the ability of the women to move on in their lives and remarry. Women could also be concerned that in overseas Islamic jurisdictions, only an Islamic divorce and not a civil divorce would be recognized. In 2012, through the LAPSO Act, the British state removed the legal aid that is available for divorce cases, making the cost of a civil increase much more high than before. So Sharia councils do serve a purpose. Without Sharia councils, these women will not have avenues to obtain a religious divorce and will end up being trapped in undesirable and abusive marriages. However, the male-dominated Sharia councils do not practice whatever gender equal provisions there are within Muslim family laws. For example, when a woman approaches the Sharia council for a khula, for a divorce, the Sharia councils ask the woman to pay a compensation to the husband in return of the divorce. Even if the woman was not paid any meher at the time of the wedding, the woman is asked to pay some compensation. On the other hand, if a man gives talaq to his wife, the man is not asked by the Sharia councils to provide maintenance to the wife in the form of meher and the iddat expenses. Sharia councils also do not follow any standard, any uniform set of standards. So the functioning of Sharia council is very shrouded in mystery. The Muslim women's groups and the legal experts that I interviewed in the course of my research, even they did not have a very clear idea about how Sharia councils are operating. One can imagine in this scenario of lack of access to information, what women going through this process have to suffer. So there is a lot of debate whether the state should ban the Sharia councils. And if the state allows Sharia councils, then should it regulate them? And if the state regulates Sharia councils, what mechanism of regulation would work? Firstly, the state cannot implement a ban on an organization which can be set up voluntarily anywhere and operates only on the basis of the credibility given to them by their community. So banning Sharia councils will only push them further underground because the demand for religious marriages and divorces is not going to go away. So there are arguments have been made in media by various academicians, by Muslim women's groups, by legal experts, that the state can consider regulating the Sharia councils. And the state can impose certain transparent codes of conduct. However, while one can imagine ways of doing it vis-a-vis big visible organizations such as Birmingham Mosque, Sharia Mosque, there is a problem because the state will not be able to apply the same regulatory framework to the various new websites that are coming up that provide divorce services, the various imams that provide divorce services, the various mosques that provide divorce services. So it's very difficult for the state to find a mechanism of regulation that would apply to both the relatively formal and institutionalized ones and the informal and uninstitutionalized ones. So my paper argues that rather than debating on whether and how the state should regulate Sharia councils, the state should shift the lens and focus on giving people rights. How can the state do that? Firstly, by giving women rights in cohabitation laws. Women in a religious only marriage, like I mentioned, are in the same position of that of a cohabitant. And the currently existing cohabitation laws don't give women rights on the breakdown of a cohabitation relationship. The marriage laws in the UK are not up to date. There's a huge gap. There's a huge number of population in UK that are opting for cohabitation relationship, and there is a huge number of population that is opting for religious only marriages. And both these groups of people are in the same boat in terms of the rights on the breakdown of a cohabitation relationship. So strengthening women's rights in cohabitation laws will also help in tackling the problem of polygamy, because currently men can have multiple religious only marriages without having any financial responsibilities on the breakdown of the relationship. Putting financial responsibility on the husband to provide for wives who have the legal status of a cohabitee can be a deterrent to polygamy. Secondly, what the state can do is to encourage civil registration of marriages. The so-called simple solution is that you get Muslim couples and other religious couples to comply with the law or civil registration of marriage. And education and awareness can play a part in that. However, there are structural changes that need to be made. The law itself needs to change because the Marriage Act of 1949, as it currently exists, indirectly discriminates against certain religions because it requires the wedding to take place in a place of worship and behind closed doors, which favors a particular religion, the Church of England. In 2020-21, the Law Commission of UK has come up with various proposals to reform the current law, the Marriage Act of 1949, of how and where the couples can get married. Its proposals include offering couples greater flexibility over the form of their wedding, I mean religious or non-religious as they prefer, and allowing weddings to take place in greater variety of buildings. So in conclusion, I would like to say that updating and amending marriage laws and providing rights on cohabitation can solve many problems that Muslim women are facing today in terms of their rights after divorce. Rather than focusing on whether the state should and how the state should regulate Sharia councils, the focus should be on how would the state protect the person. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha, for bringing out differences so vividly. Yes, the way you explained that, the inefficiency or incommensurability of the legal system to take care of the kind of practices that are going on among Muslims in UK, and particularly how there is a gap between the system that can offer legal rights to women and then the way they are treated in Sharia councils, and how justice is given, or sometimes how marriages are either solemnized or annulled. So very good. And now I invite Kavita Singh, research scholar from Center for Canadian, US and Latin American Studies, JNU, speaking on multiculturalism and Canada in 2020. Boon or bane? Kavita, over to you. Unmute.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible now? Ma'am, is it visible?
Yeah.
Kavita, bring it on presentation mode so that it becomes bigger in size. F5.
So my topic is multiculturalism and Canada in 2020, boon or bane. So first of all, I would like to give a brief introduction that what does multiculturalism mean. So multiculturalism mean that different diverse cultures, societies, different religious groups and cultural groups are like staying together and with different patterns of thinking and communicative analysis, and it also seeks the inclusion of the views and contributions of the diverse members of society while maintaining respect for their differences and withholding the demand for their assimilation in the dominant culture, rather than holding the embracing the traditional liberal image of the melting pot into which people of different cultures are assimilated uh, into a unified national culture. Multiculturalism generally holds the image of a tossed salad. So, like in the context of Canadian multiculturalism, the Canadian history of settlement and colonization has resulted in a multicultural society. So, the main founding peoples were the indigenous, the French, and the British, and other were the racial and ethnic groups. So, the indigenous people include the First Nations, status and the non-status Inuits, Metis and Inuit. So their proportion of the Canada's total population is increasing. The Statistics Canada of 2016, it reveals that over 2.1 million people have reported some indigenous ancestry, representing 6.2 of the total population by comparison with the 2011 consensus. So we can say that there is a increase and the people are like accepting their indigenous ancestry from in like in a comparison from 2016 to 2011. So we can see that the origins of Canada's multicultural policy can be found in the Royal Commission of Bilingualism and Biculturalism. Multiculturalism was introduced in Canada in the 1917. Before that, in 1948, Canada adhered to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which applies to all the human beings regardless of sex, race, religion, culture, or ideology. So we can say that the concept of Canada as a multicultural society has can be interpreted into two different ways. First, as a sociological fact, and the second one is the can be interpreted as politically. So at the policy level, multiculturalism refers to the management of diversity through formal initiatives in the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal domain. Canada became the first country in the world to introduce a multicultural policy officially in 1971, and it also established the Canadian Consultative Council on Multiculturalism in 1973. So, like we are talking mostly about the 2000, the time after the 2000, and especially after the incidents of the 9/11. So there were different policies that have been adopted by the Canadian government. And I would also like to add that the first introduction of multiculturalism that was implemented in 1971, it was implemented by the Trudeau government. Then in 2002, the government announced that the Canadian Multiculturalism Day would be held every year on 27 June. In 2005, Canada became the first country to adopt the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization on Convention of the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. In 2006, the federal government offered a full apology to the Chinese Canadians for the head tax that was imposed on Chinese immigrants until 1923 and Canada's subsequent refusal until 1947 to accept the Chinese immigrants. The government also replaced the ACE program with the Community Historical Recognition Program and the National Historical Recognition Program to commemorate the historical experiences and the contribution of the ethnocultural communities. In 2018, responsibility of multiculturalism was transferred from a different department from Canadian Heritage to the Department of Citizenship and Immigration, whose minister was renamed as the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism. In 2008, the federal government announced the Paul Yuzuk Award for Multiculturalism. In 2009, Canada became a full member of the Task Force for the International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research. So this organization was renamed on the International Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, in 2010, and Canada chaired it from March 2013 to 14. In 2010 also, Canada hosted the second annual conference on the International Inter-Parliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism. At the conference, the ICCA developed the Ottawa Protocol on Combating Anti-Semitism, and in 2011, Canada became the first country to sign it. Now there are different forms of racism in Canada, which we can see. Some are like visible and some are invisible. There is direct and indirect racism that we have seen. Like if we see the history of racism, and it has started a long ago with the coming up of the civilization in Canada. Generally, people don't come up with the direct racism, especially the different communities, particularly the South Asians and the Chinese. So in March 2005, the government released a Canada for All, Canada's action plans against racism. Its objectives were to strengthen social cohesion, to further Canada's human rights framework, and to demonstrate a federal leadership in the fight against racism and hate-motivated crime. The South Asian community in Canada has evolved from a relatively small and homogeneous population to one that is unique in its diversity. There are almost 6.7% of South Asians presently in Canada, and 37% as the minority groups in Canada. So we have seen a drastic change in the number of South Asian, which has multiplied from 1981 to 2001 because of the large mass exodus of people from the Asian continent to the North America. And most, according to Statistics Canada consensus report, most South Asians, they have this strong sense of belonging to Canada and their province and municipality, and no other visible minority group felt as strongly about belonging to Canada as the South Indians. Almost 9 in 10 indicated a strong or very strong sense of belonging to Canada, compared with the 83% of the Blacks, 77% of Chinese, and 80% of people who were not in a visible minority. So we have seen after the COVID, after the reporting of the COVID and the various statements that have been passed by Donald Trump in USA, Canada has also been affected by it. And in Vancouver, a tally of hate incidents targeting the East Asians went up 7-fold from the last year. and local and provincial law enforcement statistics have warning since last spring that more needs to be done to combat such hatred. A crowdsourced Statistics Canada found that Canadians of Asian descent were more likely to report increased harassment during the pandemic than the other people. So the whole game of this multiculturalism has been changed after Justin Trudeau came into power in 2015. The multiculturalism portfolio was being transferred from Department of Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship to the Department of Canadian Heritage. However, the objectives of the multiculturalism program were still the same as those announced in 2007. In 2018 itself, there were almost 3 lakh Indians that has got permanent residency in Canada. So we can see there is a continuous rise in the immigrants going from the South Asia towards North America. In 2016, also the government announced the creation of the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion to replace the former Office of Religion Freedom. It comes under the Global Affair Canada and serve as a focal point for engagement with faith and belief communities to consult on promoting religious freedom and human rights, among other subjects. And now I would like to conclude my study that Canada has been a pioneer for multiculturalism. Though it has its share of pitfalls, it became the preferential destination for immigrants worldwide. The adoption of multicultural policies in the 70s shows how it was ahead of its time. It has come a long way from imposing the head tax on Chinese to being home for almost 23% of Chinese immigrants, from not allowing the Indians on the Canadian land to apologize for the Komagata Maru incidents from India. The introduction of the point system in the immigration was the remarkable step which led towards the country becoming more adjusting and rehabilitating. And being the closest neighbor of the most powerful country, Canada, with its distinct policies like multiculturalism, middle power, it has emerged as a individual rather than just being the neighbor of the most powerful country of the world. In the contemporary times, we also see that the most South Asians living in the compartment, though they face some indirect racist policies, but still they are represented well in the politics, society and the government. Like currently there are around 8% of South Indians in the government. So my study will conclude that although things have been they have its shares of faults, but Canada multiculturalism has played a very important part for the growth of economy of Canada, also with its society. So the whole concept of Canadian society has come out as a immigrant country which is peaceful, which believes in integrity, which believes in policies, which believes in making which also in 2018 also Justin Trudeau passed a comment and they have allowed a number of refugees coming from Mexico to Canada. So multiculturalism has been a boon for the Canadian society rather than being a bane. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. I think Sheetal is having some connectivity issues. So we'll go on with the next presenter, Azima, right? Azima Salim, who is a research scholar at the Center for West Asian Studies. And Azima, please go ahead. You have 10 minutes.
you so much, ma'am, and very good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to speak on civil society organization, what kind of role it has towards integration and interculturalism, taking the case study of the Syrian refugees in Germany, especially after the Syrian revolution, which escalated in 2011. Uh, uh, there was a consistent instability in Syria since 2011, so this result in a large number of refugees around which got displaced in also the neighboring countries such as Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. But most of the refugees also went to the 10% of the refugees displaced went to the European nations like Germany, Austria, and Sweden, in which the majority of refugees were taken by the Germany. So basically, German Chancellor Angela Merkel adopted this policy of welcome policy for refugees in 2015, taking refugees which were stuck in the border and suspending the Dublin regulations, which was functioned there in August 2015. By declaring that all Syrian asylum seekers are welcome to remain in Germany, no matter which EU countries they have been entered first. Throughout this process, there has been so much of social, cultural, religious, psychological, and political complexities while integrating in German society. So this is where the civil society organization play a very significant role in the process of integration and interculturalism. The kind of distribution allocation which happened of refugee in Germany was among the 16 federal states through the system called Cognizant quota system. This system allocates refugees according to the state's capacity to resettle them based on their tax revenues and current populations. It was a optimistic attitude of Merkel's, who said that they can be able to accommodate and integrate refugees to a such large scale with the initiatives with the grassroots initiatives such as the volunteers, non-governmental organizations, and civil society has always been in the forefront while dealing with the gap between the limited ability resources of the state agencies and to provide a vast logistical and welfare challenges associated with the arrival of large number of refugees in a very short span of time. So basically, with this arrival of 1 million refugees between 2015 to 16, it gave a very strong sense of urgencies to imply integration process. Also, this integration is a transformation process which has a long-term ends rather than the short-term end goals, and it continued to rise with the potential frictions as all the changes processes are. When we talk about integration, those basically German integration has been specified into four major aspects, that was labor, education, urban planning, and other, and mental health, especially with the arrival of Syrian refugees. So even Germany was aware, based on their history of integration debates since 1955, they were aware the cost of non-integrations from the wasted economy and the human potential that can cause a serious strain on social cohesion and internal stability. So in the beginning, they have taken a stand to integrate it more rigorous manner and to use the grassroots initiatives of all the civil society organizations to bridge that gap and to provide a better opportunities to both the host and the guest society. Basically, if we try to understand integration, it is a two-way process and the mutual accommodations between the refugees and the host society, rather than being assimilated with the host society. Uh, the goal of this integration throughout the since the influx of refugee was also to foster participations, to engage the citizen, and to strengthen the sense of public ownership and to provide a perfect positive effect on democracy. The role of civil society organizations in accommodating refugees, especially in the case of Germany, because they need to understand, they need to recognize the need of migrants. What are the new challenges? Because every day the huge influx of the refugees has been creating a new challenges and new realities which need a consistent uh, tailoring of the situation. So if we try to understand what role the civil society played, try to tackle what kind of crisis it has, what kind of conflict they are going to conflict narratives they have been gone through, and how to promote the peace building and to function on this reconciliation. If we try to understand the German A civil society organization, one of the scholars has very broadly categorized into three major phenomena. The first phenomena, which is directly funded by the German political foundations, that is the parties who who are represented in the Bundestag of state-funded foundations. They have been receiving fund from German Aid Ministry, that is BMZ, Federal Ministry of Social and Economic Cooperation. Secondly, then there are thousands of small and medium development civil society organizations, which is linked to the church, which is linked to the secular and other business linked groups. Thirdly, there is a big church linked development networks like civil society organizations who has been functioning from a very long time in trying to integrate the migrants and the refugees which are coming in the societies, how to properly integrate. Uh, uh, the GIZ is also one of the major civil society organization in Germany. It's basically an umbrella organizations which work is not only limited towards integrations, but they have been playing a very extensive humanitarian role, especially when the crisis started in when the crisis started in Syria. BMZ also provide financial means to German NGOs which implement projects in Germany and developing countries. Funding NGOs is also regionally divided. I have gone through various civil society organizations trying to understand how the integration process has been focused on. The couple of the civil society organizations such as Refugee Clinic Law, then there is Deutsche Soldat, then there is Frederick Ebert, Stifguns. These has been playing a very significant role not only in the terms of labor but also in providing mental health, in providing language training, uh, language training, and other important things. Uh, there are many other civil society organizations which are not going the further but try to understand how they have been playing a very significant role in strengthening the integration process. One of the four aspects which I've already talked about, that is the language training and mentoring and education. As with the influx of refugees in 2015, the biggest challenge was the language. There was a huge language barriers, and this grassroots initiative tried to establish this free language courses in order to support the volunteers and to get integrated with the societies rather than being segregated or in limited. And it also opened up the opportunities to practice, especially in terms of other labors or other aspects. Then there was then there is an issue of not then there is an aspect of urban planning along with cultural and social integrations. It is to establish a new space in which they can create a sense of belongingness as well as reduce the stereotypes and prejudices on both the sides by bringing newcomers together with their host communities. They have been adopting many of the workshops, which also include cooking classes or the game classes or to other game or game classes. The biggest challenge was that the urban planning, which has to be designed by the federal government, because if the refugees are to be segregated into a camps, it will lead to a ghettoizations and disconnect from a main society. So they also, besides that, it will also help them in choosing the economic opportunities or the kind on to understand the society in a better way and to raise awareness, including integration. Refugees accommodation in the labor market is also one of the biggest aspect of integrations, because the influx of refugees was filled with both skilled and unskilled and low mid-skilled workers, where they try to utilize their skills towards a job by providing them the vocational training and providing them the opportunity how to seek the jobs. It also during the period from 2016 to 2019, Germany has also created some 1 lakh jobs that create the sense of entry for asylum seekers and familiarize them with the work environment in Germany. Other aspect was the mental health condition, how this mental health condition has become a very important aspect for for integration, especially when it comes to Syrian refugees, because Syrian refugees are the one who has also suffered a lot of traumatic experiences, going from a war, going from being genocide, and then experiencing the whole journey. So giving them a mental counseling and dealing with their PSTD. So it also creates a sense how to connect with the society again after going so much of problems. So these beside that, there are other things which also help, in which civil society also help in integrating, that is to provide a foster inclusive membership policies, then to provide a legal protection of refugees and inclusive integrative policies. A strong communication was very significant, because until unless there is no strong communications from both the sides, it will create a lot of problems and issues. And if there is a strong communications, it can ease off to understand the other person. Establishment of refugee-led organizations, which such as Benata or Salam culture or the sport culture, especially in Germany, also create a sense of belonging and trying to accommodate the refugees with the German laws. It connect with the societies in terms legally, socially, and culturally, and trying to teach the person how to be part of German society without losing their cultural identity. And then they try to raise so much of awareness raising campaign, workshops, and mutual participation and inclusion, and teaching them the human rights. But despite of so much work they have been going through, there are so much of challenges and limitations of civil society organization. Like there is a welcome cultures, but with no proper real cultures, because refugees are considered as a guest or a temporary who will go back when the situation is normalized in Syria. So this idea of going back is still very much prominent. So this idea of integration is becoming flawed in a way or the other. Then the problem of accommodation and employment is the biggest challenge for the refugees. The consistent influx of refugees is creating a lot of housing related structural problems, and which has to be dealt extensively by the federal structures, which civil society organizations find it very difficult to deal with it. Then the introduction programs, which has been introduced by the various grassroots initiatives, has been conducted. They have insufficient vocational training, and the quality and the quantity of language courses also always under the questions, because most of the refugees are not able to get their proficiency or the diploma in the language courses, which in turn create a bigger problem in the labor market. There is also a problem in collecting ethnic data because of the sensitivity of German laws, that because of historical sensitivity. It also creates problems in understanding the diversity which is there in the Syrian refugees. It becomes difficult to understand the variation of the refugees which they are dealing with. The lack of dialogue is also the biggest challenge for the CSOs, because the limited flow of information from the public to the non-stakeholders, it results in a duplication in the practice of local and regional levels. The other problems which are usually faced with the civil society is the limited or the financial problems. The last limitations which I was trying to deal is that basically there's a diverse and inclusion discourse of significant part of policy formulation. But this political discourse on immigration has also led to the rise of far-right parties. So basically the normalization of the language against scandalous language against the refugees has become so common. So it creates a sense of otherness within the integration process. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Azima. I was disconnected for a while, but a very good presentation made by you on civil society organizations and their role in Germany for integration. What is the method, Bhashruti? Do we invite questions immediately now? Please, I invite questions. You can write your questions. There's one in the chat box, and you may raise your hand and ask a question to the speaker. Please identify yourself and the speaker whom you want to ask question to. The one in the chat box is, there's nothing in mind because I got disconnected, so I have lost the question. Anshu, can you read it for me?
There are two questions. The first one is by Anvit and the other one is by Prakash. Both of them are general questions. Anvit and Prakash, can you please speak the questions? Okay, if I can't hear them, I think I'll just say the questions on my own. Okay, the first question is, the rise of new crises like migration, refugees, xenophobia, whether it affected the values of EU, goal of integration. or it had shown the true picture of EU.
Whom is it directed?
Everyone, everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah, everyone. Both the questions are like that. Yeah, and the second question is whether the EU's theory and practice, I mean, whether it is successful in doing all what it says. It also says the crisis has not solved, rather it is increasing. I think he says, does the EU practice what it preaches? And has it been successful in integrating the immigrants?
Can I answer? Because I think it's directed to in general, like anyone could answer this question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for your questions. First of all, European Union is not a supranational organization, it's a regional actor. So when you talk of the EU is it's all about normative and everything like that. What comes into play is the approach of the member states. So at the best, what EU can do is, first of all, moral exhortations, which it did in the case of the 2015 refugee crisis. So, making making Hungary and Czech Republic realize that you were also once a refugee and all that, but that really didn't work. Then the second option for EU is that to bring in legal sanctions or penalizing them. That's the most common way of them to sanction those who are not, who are acting as recalcitrant states, not complying by the EU idea of normative and, not taking in refugees under the EU quota. But that also didn't really yield any result, because as of 2020, the result is pending, and this was also highlighted by one of the former, presenters. Then if I put it in the context of Denmark, Denmark, first of all, like as Sayantan said, has opt-outs, right? So everything at the end of the day is very national in approach, because the EU at its best can only, try to coax you, try to bring in sanctions, and nothing more than that. It would not really, go beyond that. Now, for instance, if I quote the Danish, one of the rules, like in 2003, Denmark introduced the 24-year rule, which was one of the strictest, which is widely considered as one of the strictest, immigration rules across Europe. So according to which, a Dane can invite his foreign spouse only when both of them are 24 years of age, and when the couple's aggregate ties to Denmark is greater than the ties to the home country. Now, this was something which was bitterly criticized by various, regional organizations and actors, including the, the UNHCR, the Council of Europe, then also Belgium and France, who are the member states of the EU. They also criticized it. But really nothing happened, because this law is very much still in place. And why? Because Denmark says that, I mean, if you read the literature, it is very much related to its own understanding of who is a Dane. So for them, a Dane is, not just when you have the Danish passport. In addition to it, you need to have, one of the parents who is also a Danish citizen, and then who is born in Norway. So it's the third generation immigrant who is considered a Dane. So, what I'm trying to say is EU cannot go beyond, probably, apparently, as what I have read, beyond imposing legal sanctions. At the end of the day, the ball is in the court of the member states. But also, like last year in 2020, EU introduced introduced the plan for dealing with the.
Sumbul, there are other questions and others would also like to speak. You have started making another presentation. I know it was very enriching to listen to you.
Sorry, I didn't.
And there are.
I didn't realize. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Anybody else wants to add? Because there's one very interesting question which has appeared on chat box. Prakash Bhatt from Bangalore Universities. When EU says it is for multiculturalism, freedom of religion, and brotherhood, how we can interpret the rise of Islamophobia? Then how Islamic countries react about EU Islamophobia? Can it threat relationship between EU and other Islamic countries? And can Islamophobia increase terrorism activities in EU? Neha, what's your take on this?
Thank you for the question, Prakash. So since we see a rise of right-wing parties across Europe, and we also see rightist tendencies in politics, not just in Europe, but across the world today, it is impacting on the quality of democracy that exists, the freedoms that the citizens and hence the immigrants enjoy. Therefore, your first question, which says that when EU says it is for multiculturalism, freedom of religion and brotherhood, how can we interpret the rise of Islamophobia? So the rise of Islamophobia is linked to the rise of right-wing politics, because the discourse that these political parties have created affect the way the native population perceives Islam, and it contributes to Islamophobia. Then the second question is how Islamic countries react about EU Islamophobia. See, a lot of the refugee crisis that's going on has been happening in countries with a Muslim majority population. And the refugees that are trying to reach European countries from these Muslim countries are to a certain extent being provided asylum, but there are lots of complications in that, as all the presenters have been saying. So the various Muslim organizations in some of the Muslim countries, such as Muslim Brotherhood, such as Saudi Wahhabism and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they do have some sort of control over some mosques operating in countries such as Britain and France. And this interaction, the host countries do not like, because they attribute the rising fundamentalism among certain sections of youth to this linkages that they have with these groups, the fundamentalist groups such as Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So, well, I cannot comment on how these countries officially respond to it, but there are definitely linkages between the fundamentalist organizations in the Islamic countries and within EU countries, which is not liked by the host countries at all. Then the third question is, can Islamophobia increase terrorism activities in EU? Well, if there is Islamophobia and because of that Muslims will feel alienated, it can result in more and more youth feeling attracted to ideology of organizations such as IS, because we all know that identity issues, if not addressed properly, can increase into something that the state then feels, then the state can get helpless in how to deal with it.
Yeah. Thank you, Neha. We are nearing the close time of the session. Thank you, presenters. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's always nice to hear to young scholars and how do they look at certain issues and challenges. To sum it up quickly, I would say that since the title of this session was on immigration, integration, and civil society, and also presented fantastic views about how the host countries are treating the immigrants and what are the policies, how do they adopt. But to me, sometimes, it seems like an oxymoron in which we say that how the incomer or the immigrants are going to adapt to the majority culture, retaining their own culture. So it's kind of, an ambiguous situation where you pose such a great challenge and then you say you are partially fulfilling the challenge, and then there is a disconnect between the two. And the complexity of situation is going to rise further because of greater integration, greater globalization. There are very crisscrossing tendencies. At one end, we are seeing greater integration, interdependence, widening, deepening of globalization and international relationships. At the same time, inward-looking approach now of countries, respective regions, and shutting down the boundaries. As Sir was saying yesterday in the keynote, that which country has not been a fortress in that sense? Who has always been opening its door, but then how much you open, when to put your foot in the door, when to close it, when to shut it. And then it's not just a case of concentric circles, it's an overlap of number of concentric circles in terms of environment at home country, at host country, then social, political, economic integration. As Azima was talking about mental well-being, psychological issues of trauma of displacement and urban city planning and integration in terms of education, language learning. So just circles and overlap of number of issues. And then the matrix becomes so complex for us. Even if we are able to address just one thread of this complex matrix, it makes our research meaningful. And to add to last comment to all your research, just as a scholar, always incorporate an element of the methodology that you have used in preparing this paper. I wish all of you very good luck for your future presentations. Thank you, participants. I can see 38 participants in the list. Thank you very much for being here, being patient. Thank you, Bhashwati, for organizing this session and this conference to bring all of us on a platform to deliberate and discuss wonderful ideas. I sign out as chair of the session, and over to Anshu.
Thank you so much, Professor Sheetal Sharma. I mean, thank you so much for these enlightening comments and highlighting the interconnectivities of all these issues. We also thank all the participants for their well-researched papers. Thank you so much for being a part of this conference.
Thank you, Ashu.
Bye, everyone. Bye, bye, bye.
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 Anshu,
Yes, ma'am.
can you just say break for lunch and when we come back?
Okay, sure, ma'am. So,
We come back at 2, right?
yes, ma'am.
So basically for the participants, you can either continue to, be logged in. We break for 1 hour and we come back like we did yesterday at 2 and start sharp at 2. So opt for lunch.
Yeah, and some of the participants are already, okay, so